Okay, I should think we're good to go.
Good to go?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this second Women's Climate Conversation for 2022. I'm Lynn Stevens, founding member of the Congress, and I'm one of your hosts for today. Before going any further, I do want to acknowledge country on behalf of us all. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet, noting that sovereignty has never been ceded. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. And we thank Indigenous people for their stewardship of the land over many thousands of years. And we are particularly grateful for their willingness to share their wisdom and philosophy with us about care for the earth and for each other. Now look, I always forget housekeeping, so I want to do it up front and get it out of the way. So the first thing is that actually the chat is really important in this conversation. We really do want you to be part of the conversation. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're calling in from, and to make comments or add questions throughout this session, because we will have a Q&A at the end. And so please feel free to just use the chat throughout this hour we have together. The other thing I have to say is that the event is being recorded and will be mostly in speaker view, but if you don't wish to appear at all, please feel free to turn off your video. I think that's it, Janet. Is there any other housekeeping we need?
I don't think so. That's
okay, good. All right. Okay, now turning to our conversation today. Look, I don't need to tell you that we live in difficult times. There's the war in Ukraine and in other parts of the world. There are floods in our own land and environmental devastation in many parts of the earth. And our thoughts are with all those suffering at this time in our world. Never has it been more important for women everywhere to step up, and we need all our strength to do it. So in this context, I wanted to invite you to just take a breath for the moment. Let us leave some of the day-to-day stuff behind and just share an hour together as women. And to help bring us into this, I wanted to offer you a short blessing that was put up recently on social media by a Bridgetine nun. Now, I'm not religious and I'm usually not into blessings, but this seemed to me to speak for all women in these challenging times. So before we begin our conversation, maybe just take a breath, close your eyes if you like, and I'll share her offering with you. May we as women be attentive to the spirit of wisdom that dwells within us. May we act courageously, compassionately, creatively. May we believe in graced moments and new possibilities. May we glimpse the mystery at the heart of all things. May we choose life so we and our descendants can live in love. When you're ready, let's come back together for this Women's Climate Conversation. In this March conversation, we celebrate and acknowledge International Women's Day by picking up on the UN Women's theme of changing the climate, equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. Like the organisational name of Women's Climate Congress, this theme picks up on the double meaning of climate, as both the Earth's climate and the social and political climate in which we operate. Both are desperately in need of change. And we know that equality for women is needed now for effective action on climate change and a sustainable tomorrow. To help us tease out this theme, we're very excited to welcome two guest conversationalists, both of whom are members of the WCC. The first is Victoria McKenzie-McHarg, who's Strategic Director, Women's Environmental Leadership Australia, and a former chair of Climate Action Network Australia. Welcome, Victoria. And Dr. Zohl Ishtar, who's a long-term social justice advocate, a veteran of Greenham Common, an author, and co-founder with local elders of the Kapal Ulangu Aboriginal Women's Law and Culture Centre in the Kimberley. Welcome, Zohl. Victoria and Zohl will be in conversation with Dr. Janet Salisbury, who many of you will know. Janet started as a medical researcher, then ran her own successful science communications business. And this generated a strong interest in promoting community dialogue on contentious matters. And as founder of the WCC, she's driven to leave the world a better place for future generations. It's my very great pleasure to hand over now to Janet to guide us through this important topic with our guests. Over to you, Janet.
Oh, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this our March Women's Climate Congress conversation, which is sort of our offering for International Women's Day for this year. International Women's Day officially was last week, but many events sort of carry on. It seems almost the whole of March. So a very big welcome to everyone. And as Lynn said, we have picked up the theme of the United UN Women for International Women's Day, which is changing the climate equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. And I should tell you just at the outset, when I've put this title on social media, and it's a conversation we've also had in the Women's Climate Congress on a few occasions. Anyway, someone got back and said, you know, can we really hope for a sustainable tomorrow? It seems a bit of a, you know, unlikely thing that, with the way that humans behave in our society, and it's just not a term that is useful. And another term that we do also think about in relation to that, which possibly is helpful, is a regenerative tomorrow. So when we talk about a sustainable tomorrow, we're talking about a time when, when we have a regenerative approach. I think really building on the knowledge of First Nations people about custodianship of the earth and nurture of life, which is one of the central principles within the work we're doing in the Women's Climate Congress. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from our visions. Well, it is our vision statement, and maybe Nettie will put the link into the chat. So our vision is we share a vision to restore climate balance by 2030. In this future, women's leadership has helped turn the tide of political culture from polarized discord to collaboration and cooperation. Nurture of life and care for the earth are at the center of every government decision. So I think that's the regenerative aspect of this. And I'm going to read another one of our vision statements. So we've got quite a number of vision statements in our vision on our website, where Nettie will put the link, which I think if you haven't been there and had a read of them, it would be really good to do. We hope that they're quite an inspiring collection of statements. So this one says, connecting head, heart and hands, we will collaborate across all the genders to restore nurture of life and to care for the earth to the center of every decision at every level, local to national and international. So as Lynn has already mentioned, we do have two amazing speakers, conversationalists, we like to call them, joining us today for this conversation. Victoria and Zohl, welcome very much to both of you. So I'm going to introduce them, but I'm not going to sort of read out their whole bio because we've put that in the invitations. Lynn's already mentioned it, but I'm going to say a few things, and then I'm going to ask in the first little round here, Victoria and Zohl to sort of say a little bit more about themselves. So I might start with Victoria, who has held a number of positions in relation to action on climate change within different organisations, most recently the Climate Action Network of Australia, which she was the chair. And she's also led a lot of community campaigns in relation to climate change. But her current role as a strategic strategic convener of the Women's Environmental Leadership Australia, has taken you into the area of women's leadership. So I'm just wondering, in introducing yourself, Victoria, you could sort of say a little bit about your journey and what maybe took you into that interest in women's leadership and what you've learned really since you've been in that role.
Thanks, Janet, and hi everyone. It's really great to be here with you all and to see so many different people from different backgrounds coming together. I'll just acknowledge at the start that I'm joining from the lands of the Gadabinwood and the Gulidjan people in southwest Victoria, and pay my respects to elders past and present. As Janet said, my journey into this work has been in a very sort of climate-oriented sense. I've been a climate campaigner over the last 15 years. I got into this work. I'd had grown up with a very strong passion for our environment and for social justice, and I found myself working in international development because that's where I just happened to get a job. But I was reading about the impacts of climate change and how they were impacting the communities I was working with, and just went, oh my God, this is a basket case. And if I want to be supporting people who need it the most and who are the most marginalised, I've got to get in on this issue. And so I came back to Australia with a very single focused mission to be working on climate, and have done that through a range of roles, mostly in the not-for-profit space and more recently in the progressive business space, when I went for a couple of years to Bank Australia. To see what does it look like to create or to try and create system change from within business worlds. And I guess throughout that, what I've seen and learnt is the role of leadership and the role that change is driven by people who step up to influence and get things done. It's not some mystical other elsewhere thing, and we are in the business of creating change. That's ultimately what we need to see. So my question became really orientated around, well, who can drive that and how is it happening, and is that helping or hindering? And I could see quite a number of essentially gender-based issues with leadership that I thought were actually getting in the way of some of the outcomes we needed to see. And I'd been very privileged in 2016 to go through the Weller program. So Weller runs a national annual leadership development program, and I went through it in its initial year, and found that really quite transformational. So as I was having this realisation about what role I thought leadership, and specifically women and gender diverse leadership, needed to play in this work, I was then able to explore that discussion with Weller, and we're working on a plan to expand the work that we do in that space. And it's a very exciting and rapidly growing space. And in the same time that Weller is growing and flourishing, the Women's Congress is growing and flourishing. We're seeing a range of new voices step up, recognising this intersection of gender and leadership and our environmental and climate catastrophe. And there is a sweet spot here that we need to lean into, because the opportunity for change that we all hold collectively together, I believe, is really enormous.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Victoria. And now I'll turn to Zohl. I'm really tempted to read out the whole of Zohl's bio here because it is just so amazing. But I will just say a few things, and then I'll let her sort of introduce herself as well. And I'm just going to unpin. Did I pin? I'll take. Oh no. If you unmute yourself, Zohl, I can get you to come on to be the.
Oh, well, that's probably a good idea, yes.
There you go. But anyway, so Zohl is an Irish-Australian lesbian, and she has had an amazing career dating right back to the 1980s with the women's movement. It all started with the World Bike Ride for Peace, where she rode a bicycle across Australia and through Europe, speaking about nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So this took her to Greenham Common. And for any of you online who are not familiar, Greenham Common is a military base, I suppose, north of London in Berkshire, where they were planning the British government were planning to put nuclear weapons, and women's camps were set up there to oppose the sighting of nuclear weapons on this camp. The camp ended up being there for 20 years. So Zohl found herself there, and I think that was a sort of a big moment for her in the women's movement, which I'm sure she will say more about. But then after that long association at Greenham, she came back to Australia and, also spent time in the Pacific, still working with women for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific. And then finally back to Australia, where she spent 20 years living and working with First Nations women. So she's had a big background. She's written 2 books, one of them Daughters of the Pacific, about her experience in the Pacific, and the other one, Holding Yawulu, White Culture and Black Women's Law, about her experience with the First Nations women in Australia. So Zohl, I'm sort of going to ask you a similar question. I'm sorry, I probably said more about your bio. I just couldn't resist it. It's so interesting. And, you know, in that journey, what have you learned about women's leadership? And tell us a little bit more about, fill in the gaps a little bit for us.
Well, yes, I have been very privileged to have such a wonderful life, and Victoria, I just want to say thank you for speaking first. I really appreciate that. And I also feel that we have a lot in common. So that's really great. In fact, I'm sure we have all the way around the board. Yeah, I'd like to start by just saying that I'm speaking to you today from Wangal country in Djibouti, which is the name now known as Sydney. I pay my respects to the First Nations people of this vast continent and its many islands, and in particular to the women of Wirramanu community in the Kimberley, who gave me a place of belonging, where I've been living for the last 20 years. With the bosses out there, and in whose presence I learned much more about white fella culture than anybody ever wants to know. So yeah, just like to say that. So I don't have much more to add than what Janet's just spilled all my beans. Yes, I was born to a matrilineal people, and I grew up in a matrifocal family. In that the Irish, we're Celtic Irish, and my father's country is still occupied by the English in the northern counties of Ireland. And I grew up learning about my people's experience of colonization going back generations. It's not comparable to being First Nations on this amazing continent, but it has given me an insight into understanding a little teeny bit about culture, what it is to be colonized by an alien people. My first boyfriend was Aboriginal, and I learned a lot from him as well. I also had the opportunity of spending time working with Indigenous Pacific Islander peoples, particularly the women, but also the men, in the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement, which was Pan-Pacific and Indigenous led. And I took those stories to Greenham, and from there we set up a women's network, Women for a Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific, where we organised for First Nations people to speak for themselves. I have a very strong belief that people speak for themselves, and but if they're not there, then we who are white fellas must not allow ourselves to be silenced by fear that we'll be judged by our own as not being worthy of speaking. There's a lot of that going down, where there's a lot of white guilt about and it's crippling us. And colonization is two-sided. They're the colonized and they're the colonizers, and the colonizers also have a responsibility of changing what's going on this continent. So I encourage everybody to learn as much as we can and to talk to each other, but to create opportunities for First Nations to speak amongst themselves. I am a storyteller. My mother was an Irish bard. She could tell 5 stories all at the same time. And if you weren't listening properly and you say, what are you talking about? She'd just say, quiet, pay attention. Because we come from societies that don't pay attention. I've just spent 20 magnificent and challenging years out in the Great Sandy Desert with the last peoples on this continent to have contact with first, with the Gadia, with the strangers. And from them, they grew me up as a white fella in their continent and as part of their culture. I don't claim their culture. I'm very proud of my own Irish one, but we all need to know where we belong. If we are Australian, we have a whole history here that goes back to the beginning of time. And as you will hear from many First Nations people, this belongs to all of us who are here, as long as we earn it. And we earn it by gifting service. When I first started living with the women in the desert, 3 of them were aged 100, 2 aged 95. These are only guesses. The others were in their 60s to 80s. And they made it quite clear to me that I was their part of their family, but I was also a white fellow. And so we developed a culture which was a hybrid culture, 2-way. I was looking after the white fella 2-way, and they were looking after First Nations 2-way. So together we created the Kapalolunga Women's Law and Culture Centre. And because First Nations live in a continent controlled by a bunch of white fellas, and all the structures are white, there is a place for those of us who are not First Nations to stand up. I'm not advising everybody disappear off into the desert. Nobody wants that, and particularly the people out in the desert do not want that. But there is a role and there is a time to stand up. And then I got to Greenham, but that's another story which I'll talk about later.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Zohl. So I'm just going to turn a little bit to sort of relating this background, 2 very different backgrounds that we've heard about there, but at the same time, as Zohl said, the same underlying heart space to climate change. So we relate this a little bit around what, from your experiences and your working with women's leadership, I'm turning a little bit to this theme of changing climates in both its meanings, maybe, is equality, the theme says equality today for a sustainable or regenerative tomorrow, but, what does equality really look like? And I mean, we spent a lot of time as women wanting to get equal numbers, for instance, into Parliament, but is there something else about equality, the quality, the cultural thing that women bring? Because just yeah, we need to sort of pick up the pace of change a bit. We're in a bit of a an emergency situation. So I just maybe would like you to relate your experience and your work with women's leadership to that issue. You can go in either order that you like.
Victoria?
Yeah.
Sure. I'll jump in then. Yeah. That's a really big question, Janet. And I think the point that you just made at the end around the time, like this is urgent. This is troubling and a little bit of a conundrum, because there's a saying that I have found very influential that I'm probably going to massacre now, is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Yeah, lovely, right? But we've got to go real far, real fast. And how do we hold this? And what does that require of us? We know that women's leadership, all the evidence shows us, and our own experience at Wella shows us that women's leadership emphasises the collaborative and the networks. Women they ignore hierarchy. They look for collective accountability and collective responsibility. There's a whole lot in there of the together. And so we have to go super far, and the scale of change that's required requires women's leadership at the core if we're going to get that far. So that challenge number one, how are we going to get it? How are we going to hold it? How do we make space and hold each other in that? Because we know that women like and value the support of others around them when they step forward in leadership. And I'm saying leadership, but I don't just mean formal roles, although that absolutely matters, and we should not be shying away from formal roles and responsibilities and power, but recognising leadership comes from the bottom up, from sideways, in all its manifestations that women step into. But how do we also, while we do that and we honour the space that women look to in their leadership, how do we go fast? And in some ways, there's something that this moment requires of us that is, well, you could say new, and a very new and big challenge. But potentially I suspect that there are many cultures who have faced enormous challenge in the past, who've had to step up and make changes that are far-reaching and fast. And so how do we look to leadership through crisis and through times of challenge that's happened elsewhere, and learn from that to strengthen our leadership as women and gender diverse people?
Thanks. Thanks, Victoria. Zohl, do you want to add something to? Oh, hang on, I've got it. You're on mute for the moment. Can you just have? Yeah.
This thing about togetherness, that is the Greenham Common experience. There's also the out in the desert, definitely, but from the Greenham Common experience, women came from all around the world. There's quite a lot of us Australians there. And also there was the First Nations peoples that women living at Greenham brought over to speak their story. One of the things that happened at Greenham was we were all different. Some of us were lesbian, some of us were heterosexual. Some of us hadn't quite figured out which way they were going, and all of us were women who loved women. We loved ourselves as women, and we loved other women. We had men in our lives, some of us, husbands, boyfriends, sons, uncles, fathers, you know, like, but it wasn't about men, and it wasn't about together with men. It was about together as women. And that developed, that put down really deep roots, because we were 7, sometimes 13 different camps around a 9-mile military fence. And we lived there in contact with the earth. We lived on Greenham Common, which is bush country, if you can speak of bush in England, but anyway, bush country. And we that importance of connectedness with Earth, connectedness with the life forms of which we are but one that live on this earth, is so important to our strength. But also there's a development of courage and a backing of giving support and receiving support. Gifting service, receiving service is a two-way stream. One does not gift service, such as, you know, my caring for the women elders, without receiving a hell of a lot of stuff back. It is such a amazing experience. And the other thing is to do it over a prolonged period. Now, you've just said fast, you know, we don't have time, but we've still got to do it. We've got to do it surely, and we've got to do it fast. And the surely thing is to make sure our feet are on the ground. And the fast thing is to make sure that we're together with others who are doing the same thing. And so what was happening with Greenham women is that we would sit around the fire, and when you first arrived at Greenham, you would wonder, what on earth are, oh no, these women must be saints. Who are they? I mean, thank you so much for saving my planet for me. No, the longer they were at the fire, the longer they were part of just sitting and being, they found themselves, we found ourselves, and we became rooted in that place. It's the same as spending 20 years in the desert, totally rooted in one place and seeing all the seasons and being with all the people, just the whole amazing adventure of both ways of being. So one of the things that was strongest about how women related at Greenham was the autonomy. First Nations people are born autonomous. From the moment they are babies, they know how to actually relate. They're taught how to relate. They can go to any house they want for whatever food. Everybody will look after them. So at Greenham, we developed the same sort of autonomy, where if you wanted to go do something, you went and did it. And if somebody else didn't like what you had just done, they would go and undo it. It's quite interesting. For example, one time some women broke into the military base and stole some grog, and some other women said, no, that's not a good idea. Besides, it's Christmas. So they broke into the base and put the grog back. You know, that sort of thing. There wasn't any arguments. There didn't need to be. And that's an Indigenous way of being, because if you, before we white fellas got there and started setting up sit-down places, missions, you know, cattle stations and things, the people would just get up and go. And if there was an argument, families would go in two different directions until the argument was over and they'd come back together again. There's no fighting. There was payback. It was totally legal, Aboriginal way. It was totally legal. It was well defined. Us white fellas turn up and people are being beaten wrong way. People are getting hurt. It doesn't happen in where payback happens, where it's strong and proper way, with the elders governing it. So I want to say that with autonomy comes the concept of self-right. You have a right to exist. You have a right to be. You have a right to change the world and stop this nonsense with all this climate. But it develops from respect for other people. It develops from responsibility for other people. And this is one of the many, many things that we as white fellas, as settlers, as Guardia strangers, can actually learn from the peoples on whose countries we we're standing and live. So Greenham was pretty wonderful in that way, and one of the things, just going on to climate, no, maybe I'll leave that till later. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Thanks very much. So I think that's, well, first of all, I'm just going to say, please, everyone, feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat. In sort of 5 or so more minutes, 10 minutes, we'll see if there's some questions there that Lynn will come back in and moderate a Q&A. So just go for it in the chat. And yeah, some really interesting things coming up there from Victoria, this idea of go fast, go far. I mean, that's, for me, that's an incredible tension. It's something we felt right from the very beginning of the Women's Climate Congress. And interestingly, one of my inspirations for forming the Congress was the 1915 International Congress of Women, which was the only peace conference of World War I. And Emily Hobhouse, an amazing social reformer from Britain, in her introductory remarks said, a movement has to be as wide, as deep as it is wide to bring forth something new. So in a sense, this idea of you need to be wide and going together, that is, I suppose, but also at the same time deep, which means you have to sort of go deeply into the sort of meaning of what you're doing. And I suppose that's what we've been trying to do in the Women's Climate Congress, but it can feel a bit overwhelming at times. I mean, just having an idea and going for it on your own seems like quite an attractive proposition sometimes. But yeah, and so that I find that tension a really interesting one. And the other one, Zohl, you've talked about the importance of women's spaces, and I suppose both in Wella and in the Women's Climate Congress, that is something we're trying to do, is to create space for women to find their autonomy. I mean, that seems, and we have learned that from other First Nations women that we have spoken to, that women are autonomous and our political systems haven't given us our autonomy fully today. And just being there in equal numbers doesn't necessarily give us that if the whole culture isn't accepting of that. So I just want to move on slightly to something that we're preparing now for our second event in the National Congress of Women series of events that we're holding. And that event's at the end of April. And we're sort of starting to think about an idea that we've had right from the start, which is to create a sort of what we call a Women's Charter for Change. Well, we didn't originally call it a Women's Charter for Change. That name came out of our first National Congress of Women event, because women that were there in the conversation suggested this idea of it being called a charter. And it's something we want to create, which is a very definite voice coming from the autonomous spirit of women, I suppose, but practical enough that it will be actionable, something that we can present to society and to government that has things in it that are sort of actionable to do at a political and cultural level, but inspirational enough to know that women think, well, this is an expression of who we are. So I'm sort of going to both ask Victoria and Zohl to sort of comment on what that kind of idea brings up for you, and some what maybe off the top of the first line, off the top of the head suggestions for what you might put in a Women's Charter for Change. So shall we go to Victoria again first? Oh, but don't forget to put your things in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, maybe I'm going to weave the two themes, if that's okay. So just still caught on that initial discussion we were having. And Zohl, you picked up and said, well, the fast is the togetherness. And yeah. I think there's something really in how we think about the togetherness and the web and the way that we work as networks as women, and how we operate still collectively and networked, but bring autonomy, bring leadership, bring initiative, keep moving. And where does this overlap with the women's spaces? And one of the things I was really struck by an article I read not so long ago. It's not a new article, and I'm sure many of you have read it. It was by an American writer and feminist called Bell Hooks, and the piece is From the Margin to the Centre. And she talked about, and this was sort of the year I was born, she was writing about some of the strengths, but also the failings of women's spaces, particularly if they're white-dominated women's spaces, where women are using those to sort of step out of a system that's not working for them and to nurture themselves and find the ways they want to work and lead. Great, all good to hear, but then get comfortable and stay in that space of nurture and support for themselves. We've got a revolution to create. There is work to be done. This is not a place to get comfortable. This is a place to get your power, find your network, do the together so that we can go far and fast together and use that network and that web for its full power and, you know, be autonomously stepping into that. So I think that there's something I really like in how those themes weave, but it puts the challenge back to us to hold the scale of change that we need to, and that sense, that revolutionary spirit and drive, not to get caught in the comfort. And I guess the way then I'd weave that into this consideration of a charter is the more boring way of expressing that is governance. Yeah. There's a piece of this that is about governance and the spaces that are created, whose voices get heard in the process, and how are they empowered from the margins and put at the centre in how this is developed for the Congress, as well as for should government take that forward. So I think that governance and input really matters.
Thanks. Zohl, do you want to?
Governance and input a lot. Yeah, totally. One of I've been thinking about Greenham while I was thinking about this talk, and I just wanted to, you know, you've asked what to put in the Women's Charter of Change, and I looked at some of the strategies that Greenham women tapped into that enabled us to be successful in bringing an end to the Cold War. Gorbachev actually thanked the Greenham women. He said, "I didn't trust Ronald Reagan, but I trusted the Greenham women." There's a film that's just come out called Mothers of the Revolution. It's on YouTube, and it's also doing different screenings around Australia, New Zealand, Aotearoa. But the themes for me were the emboldening empowerment of women by having fun in women-only space, and the connectedness and the sense of belonging to community that comes by living together in a shared place where our commonalities are respected and our differences are honoured. And then the sense of belongingness that comes from living on the ground with the rest of the natural world. These are things that are too often overlooked. The importance of women's space. I just love Women's Climate Congress as a beautiful place, women's space to be in. I recently, only just the last couple of days, had the opportunity to meet with a professor of psychology, Felicia Herbert, who studies the importance of mindfulness, compassion, and action. She says that when we're experiencing kindness, attention, bodily awareness, and emotional regulation, that enables both individuals and communities to thrive and flourish. I'm really keen to know a lot more about her work. She's an emeritus professor, and she's talking on the 18th at some conference. But the thing is that Greenham, you talked about revolution, Victoria. Greenham was a revolution. You know, and it is time if the message is, if Greenham women can do it by living on the common together, in all our autonomy, in all our arguments, you know, all of our you know, being women in this particular societies, if we can do that and we can change the world, we need to change the world now as far as climate's concerned. And we can do that if we create women-only spaces where we can grow each other up and hold on to each other, nurture each other, protect each other. That doesn't mean forsaking the male members of our family, but it says we need women's spaces to create. We've got Extinction Rebellion. It would be really nice to see a women's version of that. So, or even sprinkle Extinction Rebellion with women's versions of that. I don't know and I don't care, but I am a really strong believer in the importance of women's space.
And the other day, Zohl, you mentioned the idea that, you know, in relation to something that we could ask for, that government, well, in decision making, apart from the fact that it would be good to have equal numbers of women at the table, but there also could be a sort of some referral to a women's council or to women more generally to get this input of, well, to rebalance, I suppose, what has been such a sort of a patriarchal system and a lens, a male lens that policy has to date been put through. So some referral to a women's council or a women's group to...
Well, that really fits in with the autonomy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be autonomous as women. We can be better allies to our brothers, our husbands, our uncles, our sons, if we are stronger in ourselves. And the strength that comes from being with other women in women's space cannot be imagined. It has to be experienced.
Yeah. So I'm going to sort of go back to Lynn now to see if there's anything coming out of the chat or that she has something else. So I'm just going to spotlight a few people so that we've got everybody in.
Yeah, thanks everyone. There's been a lot of sharing of information in the chat, which is fantastic. And there are a couple of issues that struck me. And one was, I might bring the two together. One was about the fact that apparently, and I haven't seen this confirmed, but it's been shared with us that a judge has declared that Susan Ley does not have a duty of care to future generations. So I want to put that out there. And someone else saying that sometimes what we're trying to do can seem totally daunting. Even though we've talked about women's collective power and the joy of women's spaces and all of that stuff, it is a big task. And so sometimes the reality of a legal decision like that and our aspirations can lead to people feeling overwhelmed. So I wondered if Victoria and Zohl, you might just comment on that, how to deal with that feeling of overwhelm. So it might start with you, Victoria, and then come to Zohl.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this is the solution to the feeling of overwhelm, but I think there is a piece about accepting, which is just not easy, but accepting the reality in which we currently exist, which is that the system is deeply flawed. It is not surprising that the legal system did not just give us a nice little pathway there to solution, done, duty of care, and we're solved. This is not the reality in which we live, and accepting the system doesn't work, the system needs to change, and just getting real comfortable with that, and therefore with the fact that if you want to be an agent of change or doing something this, you're going to have to be a part of changing that system. That's the piece, I think, that for me has been really important, because that has allowed me to have moments like this, and assuming that's what just happened, not be a devastating blow, but to go, gotcha, yep, that system is still flawed. Let's go. What is our work? And still props, like huge props to the people who are trying to use the elements of the system to make change and to create that challenge, and that highlights where the problems are. So I'm certainly not saying those strategies aren't important. We need it all, and we need to recognise what we're up against and how we change. But in that, that is hard work as well. It's, in some ways, for me, accepting those challenges is the same as the acceptance of we are now living with dangerous climate change. This is no longer a future proposition. This is our day-to-day life. And some of us even on this call have been living with the extremities and the impacts of that in our homes in the last weeks and months. And we have to find ways to hold each other in that. So from both a problem and impacts side, as well as the solutions and how we create change, accepting our reality so we can step into what we need to do feels like that first challenge.
Thanks, Victoria. So do you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, I would like to. Holding each other. Yeah, this is essential to the whole thing. I want to pick up on what you mentioned before, Janet. Head, heart, hands. I think it goes the other way around. I think it starts with hands, action. If you're being overwhelmed, get active. You don't have to work it all out. You know, that will come. And then you'll be wondering what the other quandaries are. But hands first goes into the heart. And from the heart, then we can actually take a peek and find out what our head is thinking. So the head becomes informed by the actual groundedness, by the engagement, by the being, like action. I mean, yes, there is a place for talking. We were talking about this the other day, actually, weren't we? The importance of talking, the importance of action. But yeah, so many times at Greenham, we saw women coming who were just overwhelmed. I mean, not one of us ever went there without being overwhelmed, because that was unique. It was rare to be in a women-only space. It was quite frightening for a lot of women. And meanwhile, we have we're sitting on the edge of a military base full of nuclear weapons that could wipe out Russia in 8 minutes. Yeah, we had some things to worry about. It was best to start at around the fire, and that's important. That is the message of Greenham. Greenham's message is do it. That revolution is possible. That we can change this. All we have to do is do it, and the way we do it is by having fun. If we're not having fun, we're doing the wrong thing. So, change and, governance, it has to come from the women's side. I'm a woman. I do not want to be governed by a man. And in actual fact, I can't be governed by a man because the man doesn't live in my reality. So when I just want to talk about climate change. I mean, out in a desert, I experience climate change. When we go hunting on a regular basis, like every couple of days, we'd be out in the bush hunting. And the women's side, men were off doing their own business. And we'd go hunting. And when I first went there, we would always come home with food. But to the end of it, excuse me, I've just got 2 men up here staring at me, wanting to do something. What on earth are you doing? Okay. They're the electricians. In the flood here, all the the lights. No, yeah, the lights went out. So we've had to have the whole building rewired. What was I talking about?
About climate change, Zohl, but I would
yes,
really like to
desert.
ask another question as well, if I could. So
Okay,
do you want to just finish that up?
I just want to say that in the desert, we couldn't eat, you know, we were only dependent on shop bought stuff. And that meant that the kids weren't getting their culture, the people's health was getting worse, etc., etc., etc. We got to get back to that.
Okay.
Climate change.
It's real. Thank you, Zohl, and thanks, Victoria. I want to just bring up one last question, if I could, which picks up. We've talked a lot about women today and about our collective connections and all of that sort of stuff. But one of the comments was in thinking about the Charter, how do we be much more inclusive of women from different social backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, not only Indigenous women, but many of the women who come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, who may be very much marginalised in this kind of women collectiveness. So I wondered, again, we might start with you, Victoria, and then finish with Zohl.
Happy to jump in, although I defer to Zohl's long history and experience of working with Indigenous communities in particular. And I'm sure, again, Greenham would have done this work extensively. This is work, I think, is the actual, that's the biggest point, is it's not just going to happen because we say, oh, but you're welcome, because that's, and again, people have seen the system. The system is not welcoming. And so we need to create spaces that are open and welcoming. We absolutely need to communicate it in a way that works for the diverse audiences, not just how we're used to communicating it. But then also we need to be willing to hear and recognise that maybe different communities are talking about the same issues in different ways, because we're using a set of language and a way of working that has been working for us. And coming from the environment movement, I know we talk around policy and we talk around a whole range of different things that we think of as climate action, but I've had some really direct feedback from some community organisations saying, well, actually, for our community, we're talking about food security. We're talking about food, and that's actually our way of engaging into this lens of nature. And our connection to nature is through our connection to food. And great. So how do we start thinking about entry points? Now, that's just one very specific example, but the broader is where are people at, and how do we make sure the doors are open, and that we do the work of going and speaking and creating accessible spaces, not just saying we're open, come work with us where we're at. It has to change. We have to change how we're working.
Thanks, Victoria. Just 1 minute, Zohl, I'm afraid.
I actually can only say ditto.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. You speak for me.
I wouldn't dare, Zohl.
And back to Janet now to close the session.
Well, yes, this 1 hour always seems to go in a flash, and we really appreciate that people do come, and it's in their lunchtime for many people. So it's good to finish on time. And I just would really like to thank our two guest conversationalists who have enriched us so much with their conversation about women's leadership and climate change, and how we can work together and try and go far and fast. I'm taking away the fact that Gorbachev said that he didn't trust the governments, but he did trust the Greenham women. I mean, I think that quote of the day, quote of the month, quote of the year, probably. Thank you very much, Zohl, for that. So yeah, thank you both very much for your time. I'm just going to end by quickly sharing my screen, put on, is that the right one? Oh, come on. Our next events. So that's it's not letting me go into that. Sorry about this, taking up time. Yeah. Oh, it's not letting me change the thing. Sorry, usually works okay. There. So our next event on April the 12th, we've got two more wonderful women conversationalists, Helen Bailey-Fisher, who's the convener of the Equality Rights Alliance, and she's going to be particularly speaking about what's happening right now, which is the Commission for the, what does the S stand for? The Status of Women, Commission for a UN organisation, the Commission for the Status of Women, are holding their big international meeting at the moment, and climate change is a focus of that. So Helen will be able to talk a little bit about that, and she's going to be joined by Sienna Anguilla, who is a wonderful young gender equality advocate and researcher in intersectionality in relation to the sort of issues that we've been talking about. So that I encourage you to go and register for that one. And also not to forget that our next National Congress of Women event will be held on the 28th of April online. It's another one-day online event, and the program is getting fixed and it's up on our website. So please go to the website to have a look at that. So that's two more events coming up, and we thank you very much again for your time today, and goodbye to everyone. Goodbye.